For days and days and days we'll never gaze at where there's... sorry. It's one of my specialties on the ukulele. My apologies to the composer. Hello, everyone. We're back. Are you enjoying it thus far? Remember, this is the 21st annual Satchmo Summerfest, and I'm here to welcome you once again to the Satchmo Legacy Stage. And this year, the stage is dedicated to the memory of Joni Berry. She's a longtime friend of the festival. She ran for many years her parents' foundation, the Joseph K. and Inez Eichenbaum Foundation, and she passed away in 2020 due to the pandemic. And so we're dedicating this stage to her. I ask you, if you get a chance to, it's on the program as well, the little background information on her. She herself was a dancer. Most of her life was spent in the charitable world, but she was a dancer. She danced with the likes of Gene Kelly and Sammy Davis Jr., and she danced with her favorite, also mine, Donald O'Connor. So take the time to do it. And Stephen's not here this time, but give Stephen a hand for helping us out with this stage this year. Also, the festival is made possible through the generosity of our sponsors and is supported through your purchase of official festival merchandise. You'd look good in one of those t-shirts. And cold beverages, and it is hot out there, and so cold beverages are a good idea. And so you are kind of getting your name virtually onto this stage just by buying a cold beverage, right, Ricky? You got famous people right in the front row. My goodness, this place, high tone. Our other sponsors include a Chevron, of course, whose logo is a chevron. It's true. That's why, you know. Also, the Jazz Museum here at the Mint, and I want to give a special, let's give a big hand to Aiden and Travis, who are doing a lovely job with the, and of course to Bad Andy, who's running the stage. Give him a big hand of applause. Also supporting the stage this year is the Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation, Janice Folks, and Richie and Vicky Norregan. Give a hand for all of them. All right, this is our penultimate presentation, and it features John McCusker. Now, I met John McCusker over 30 years ago. I must have been 9. I love Jack Benny. Anyway, I met him I moved here about 31 years ago, and I met him very early on. I worked for a record company. He was doing this photography project for the Times-Picayune called The End of the Beginning. It was brilliant. He did it in collaboration with Scott Aegis, and they took photographs of like the Humphrey Brothers, all the old musicians, and it was beautiful. It includes my favorite photograph of Danny Barker, who I was very close to, because it revealed his more complicated nature than the kind of the smiling guy playing the banjo. And it was really a beautiful thing. And if you have a chance, you can find the Danny picture on LouisianaDigitalLibrary.org. Just search John McCusker, and it comes up. But it was really great. Since that time, that was part of his, happened during his over 30-year career with both the Times-Picayune and then the Advocate more recently. He was part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize after Hurricane Katrina. His photographs were part of that prize. In the 90s, he started offering the Cradle of Jazz tours, and which has been very successful and highly regarded. Also, he's written 2 books, Creole Trombone, Kid Ori in the Early Years of Jazz, and most recently in 2019, Giacomo, The Native Roots of Mardi Gras Indians. He did that in collaboration with Shane Leaf, and they were published by University Press of Mississippi beginning in February of 2021. Ending. That was the end of the beginning. He had worked on it for years previous. He founded the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House in La Place, Louisiana, and he is the founder and the managing director, and it's my great privilege to bring him to you. His name is John McCusker, and give him a big hand of applause.
I guess I could do it this way. After years social isolating on 4 acres in the country outside of New Orleans, it's amazing to just be in a room with human beings. So I'm so glad that you're the human beings who are here. Thank you for being here. How about we start this from the beginning? Hey, look at that. Wow. All right. Who's Dut? Well, we know who Dippermouth is. As much as people today will use the Satchmo nickname. If you knew Pops in New Orleans, there's another one. If you knew Pops in New Orleans, you knew him by the name Dipper, and everybody called him Dipper or Dippermouth. And if you knew Kid Ory, you didn't call him Kid, you didn't call him Ory, you called him Dut. That was his nickname. That meant dude in Creole. So we're going to talk about Dipper and Dut. And we're going to talk about the 2 critical things that happened in Lewis's life in 1913 with the direct bearing on the man and the musician he became. The first was an arrest at the dawn of 1913 for firing a gun in the air at Rampart. Oh, hey, Ghost in the Machine. At Rampart and Purdue Street to celebrate the new year. Now, if you've read My Life in New Orleans, Lewis brings incredible, vivid tellings to that neighborhood, but you really have to imagine it in your head, because when you look back at that period and try to find pictures of New Orleans, you find the same Jackson Square picture that we'd find today, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. Which is why I was very happy when my late friend Tad Jones told me that he had discovered a photo of the whole neighborhood, and he described what the picture looked like, but he didn't tell me where he found it, and he didn't show it to me. Well, Tad died in 2006, but I knew it was out there, and I went and found it, and here it is. We're looking at, maybe I should do this way. We're looking at the back of town. Now, you hear a lot of people arguing about what the back of town is or is not today, but in terms of when Louis Armstrong grew up, this was the back of town. And what we're looking at here, is that not showing up? Oh, well, I can just point. What we're looking at here, sorry, I'm going to go Vegas Lounge act on you here. This is Purdue Street. Here is the Hibernian Bank Tower, the Eagle Saloon. Pythian Temple is over there. This is Funky Butt Hall, where Buddy Bolden played. And right next door, 1303 Purdue Street. This is probably the only picture you'll ever see of that address. That's where Louis Armstrong grew up, from the age of 4 till when he went into the Wave Sound. There's the blow up. Across the street, the Fisk School, where he attended school briefly and not very enthusiastically. And here is an aerial. So what we've got here is Poydras Street, Perdido, Gravier, South Rampart, Basin, Franklin, Liberty. Whoops. Sorry, there we go. So on New Year's Eve, 1912, 1913, Lewis went to join his quartet in Perdido Street. But before he left, he snuck a gun out of his mom's footlocker. Now, in My Life in New Orleans, he says it was his stepfather's gun. The interview with his sister makes it clear it was his mama's gun. And if you read anything about Lewis's mom, you would have no doubt that she would be armed. They went down there to sing, to try to raise some money. Just like you see the kids with the buckets or working the streets today. They weren't supposed to be doing this, but they did. And they just finished singing. And discharged it onto Rampart Street. Two detectives who had been alerted to people firing guns in the air arrived and disarmed Lewis. Wait, this thing's taken off on its own. Oh my goodness. Ghost in the machine. The juvenile court sentenced Lewis to the Colored Waifs Home, a reform school for black youth located at City Park Avenue in Conti. There he received his first sustained education in music, eventually becoming the home's bugler and the leader of its brass band. This story's been told widely. It's a shot of the brass band before Lewis was a member. This little guy here, that's his friend Isaac Smoot, who he calls Ikey Smooth in his autobiography. And interesting guy, but he was in the brass band before Lewis joined. All right, so we've heard that story a million times. Let's move on from there. Often overlooked is Labor Day of that same year. That's when 12-year-old Lewis met 26-year-old band leader Edward Kid Ory, while both led their respective brass bands in a parade. So who is Kid Ory, and why was this meeting important? Kid Ory's legacy is sometimes reduced to his 1920s recording work as a sideman, most notably to Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and King Oliver. Not to poo-poo that, that's pretty much a jazz trifecta right there as 1920s sessions go. And is the composer to Muskrat Ramble and Savoy Blues. As a trombonist, he's often described as the tailgate style's most faithful and imitated proponent, if not its most technically adept. And his was the first black jazz band from New Orleans to record, and he was a prominent figure in the jazz revival. That's the thumbnail biography and the representation you find of Kid Ory. Do the Mic test. Who's fighting and what for? All right, there we go. Those achievements happened after he left New Orleans in 1919. What if I said Kid Ory's most significant contributions to the evolving music occurred a decade sooner, when he was an early New Orleans jazz band leader and stylistic protagonist? Many, including Lewis, Pops Foster, and Wellman Bros, said Ory's was the hottest band in the 1910s, with featured players like King Oliver, Johnny Dodds, Jimmy Noon, Mutt Carey, and Johnny St. Cyr. Ory's New Orleans band played gigs at Franklin Street cabarets, as well as country clubs, St. Charles Avenue hotels, and debutante dances. Indeed, it was Ory's band that spanned all those diverse venues every week and brought the music to a wider audience. Which y'all are welcome. Come sit over here if you can't see the pictures, please. I mean, it's, I did the shadow puppets, so I want you to be able to see them. Ory's musical journey from teenage follower of Buddy Bolden to John Robichaux to becoming the New Orleans band leader who hired Pops is nothing short of a roadmap to the evolutionary process underway during the decade before the Jazz Age. And I think this is really noteworthy. If you look at his otherwise very fine film, Jazz, by Ken Burns, he effectively jumps from the end of Buddy Bolden's career in 1906 to the emergence of Pops in 1918 like those 10 years didn't even happen. And I would argue that whatever Bolden did, which we'll never know in terms of what he exactly sounded like, we know that between 1906 and 1918 is when the rubber hits the road in terms of the form coming together. The instrumentation of bands is still evolving. All the dance bands in 1910 have a violin. By 1920, the violin's gone. Most people have switched from valve trombone to slide trombone. By 1920, that wasn't true in 1910. So you had all kinds of evolving and moving targets that are going on there, and that was completely ignored. All right, so that begs the question, who was Kid Ory? Boy, there we go. All right, there's it go. So who was Kid Ory? Well, here's the quick thumbnail. Kid Ory was 15 years older than Lewis. He's born on a plantation quarters at the Woodland Plantation in La Place, Louisiana, where our museum is today. He is the child of a mixed-race family. His father is white, his mother is Creole of color. They lived together as husband and wife for 30 years. The church refused to marry them. Lived together in the quarters. This is something of a scandal out there. Imagine a rural Louisiana county parish where you've got a mixed-race couple living in the quarters at a plantation. Didn't happen everywhere, but it happened there. We don't know if this is the house Kid Ory was born in, but this is what dwellings look like on the Woodland Plantation. So there's a 1 in 23 chance this is the house he was born in. Some of these structures still exist, and we've tracked a few down, and we're trying to get some brought to our property. Well, Kid Ory grows up interested in music. His first music making is in a barbershop harmonizing group. Wow, who does that sound like? Sounds like Lewis, and it sounds like Jelly Roll Morton. How many jazz history books have you seen that mention barbershop harmonizing groups? Something that's very important. Interested in making instrumental music but not having the money to buy an instrument, he starts making his own instruments out of cigar boxes. In fact, by the 1890s, the Boy Scout handbook had plans for how to do. Check, check. Yeah, it's the cord down here I keep stepping on. That's why it keeps going out. It's under here, I think. This is that. Oh, okay. Okay. Here, I'll just hold it. Hey, I'm wireless. Okay. God, I feel like I'm Bill Murray and I'm taking the room down a minute. Okay. So he started making cigar box instruments, violins, that sort of thing. That was not unique to Kid Ory. Lots of other people did that too. Then in October, November 1905, he travels to New Orleans for the first time. He's a teenager, and he wants to buy a trombone. So he goes to the #1 music store in New Orleans, the Werlines for Music. And he buys the horn, and he's heading back to his sister's house. Now, unbeknownst to him, because this is his first trip to the city, his sister lives on Robertson Street at the intersection of Jackson Avenue. Well, we know that intersection from the Jelly Roll Morton Jelly Roll Morton Library of Congress, where he talks about that corner being the hangout corner. So if you were a musician looking for a gig, or you were a band leader looking for a man, you would go to the hangout corner. Of course, Ory doesn't know this. He's 17, he's got his new horn, he's probably just thinking about that. He's trying the horn out at his sister's house. Knock comes on the door. He answers it, and there's this tall, brown-skinned man there that he said spoke in a very low voice that he imitated. And he says, "Young man, is that you playing the trombone?" And he says, "Yes, sir, I just got it." Well, it turned out the man was looking for a trombone player, and he says, "Do you know who I am?" And Ori goes, "No, I'm from the country. It's my first trip here." And he says, "I'm the king." And of course, that was what people call Buddy Bolden, King Bolden. And here he was, his first trip to New Orleans, and Ori meets Buddy Bolden. Now, there's no Google image search then. He didn't know what Buddy Bolden looked like, but he certainly knew the name. And here he is on his doorstep on his first trip to New Orleans, asking him if he wants to come and play with him. Well, Ori's older sister told him no. Actually, I would assume it was probably hell no. You're not going off with Buddy Bolden. But Ori starts coming into New Orleans regularly along with the other guys in his band like Lawrence Dewey, Louis Matthews, Joseph Matthews. And it's clear that that's where he gets his early interest in music. But here's where Ori's witness to the early days of jazz, I think, is so instructive. Because it's not just simply, oh, Buddy Bolden begot this, and everything was there, and he created jazz like it was an internal combustion engine or Thomas Edison making a light bulb. What Ori tells us it's so instructive is, yeah, at first it was Bolden because he was the only one that was playing the blues for dancing in this era. But eventually, once I learned more about music, that's a quote from Ori, then I could see Robichaux. After he could see Robichaux, what that meant was he understood more about music than Buddy Bolden is. He says Bolden played for effect, and people went for it. But he wasn't really a musician, meaning he didn't study music. He couldn't take the next step. So Ori tried to bridge the musicality, professionalism, showing up on time, showing up not drunk, that was associated with the Robichaux band, but with the blues for dancing that Buddy Bolden had. And he put it together, and what he called it was soft ragtime. We came up with another name for it. By the way, if you read Don Marquis' book, and Don and I were old drinking buddies. I just found out yesterday he died. I did not know that. So rest in peace, Don. If you read his book on Buddy Bolden, he talks a lot about Lincoln Park. And if you read my book on Ori, he'll talk a lot about Lincoln Park and playing at Lincoln Park at the skating rink. Well, this is the skating rink. And it was constructed in the summer of 1906. Well, it opened for the summer of 1906, which was Bolden's last year as an active musician. And John Robichaux's band would play at the Pavilion in the afternoon and evening, and then Bolden would show up at night and stick his horn out of one of these windows at the Lincoln skating rink, blow his horn, and everybody'd know that Buddy Bolden was going to show up, and things were going to get a little different. Others around Ori, like the Matthews Brothers, Rabbit Robinson, Lawrence Dewey, followed the Bolden gigs at Funky Bud, Oddfellows, Globe Halls, and Lincoln Park. Dewey stated emphatically, that's where we stole the jazz. That's where all New Orleans musicians got their idea of Buddy Bolden. In 1910, Ori brought his band from Laplace to New Orleans and started a 9-year residency. On the day he met Louis, Ori was 26 and leading this band in the Black Labor Day Parade, a procession that included 1,200 stevedores, draymen, and cotton press workers. The march wound through the back of town before heading downtown and up Esplanade Avenue to the fairgrounds for a picnic and dance. Thunder showers fell much of the day, so perhaps this interaction occurred under a barroom awning during a rain delay. I heard a trumpet back there, Ori said. Nice, good, solid tone to it. I turned around, we stopped for a beer break, and a sandwich, and he's blowing. Ori crooked his finger at the 12-year-old, saying, "Come here, I want to tell you something. You're doing a good job." And Ori told him, "Thank you, Mr. Ori," is what Louis said, and Ori told him, "You're going to be all right one day." Ori was always a good spotter of talent. And when he was released from the Waves home in the summer of 1914, Louis became a regular at Ori band gigs at Betsy Cole's, street parades, and National Park. Ori remembered, in those days I had a brass band I used for funerals, parades, and picnics. Benny, the drummer in my brass band, had taken Lewis under his wing. One evening, Benny brought Lewis, who had just been released from the Waifs' home, to National Park where I was playing a picnic. Benny asked me if he could let Lewis sit in my band, and I remembered the kid from the street parade, and I gladly agreed. Lewis came up and played Old Miss and the Blues, and everybody in the park went wild over this boy in neat trousers who could play so great. I liked Lewis's playing so much that I asked him to come and sit in with my band anytime he could. Lewis came several to different places where I worked, and we really got to know each other. He always came accompanied by Benny, the drummer. In crowded places, Benny would handcuff Lewis to him with a handkerchief so Lewis wouldn't get lost. Oops. Sorry, I'm losing my clicker here. Okay. I'm sorry, I just lost my view of my show. So sorry about these technical problems today. There we are. The applause for Armstrong's cameos with the band won Ori over, this despite the fact that young Lewis only knew a couple of songs. Unlike Ori, who came up when bands were just beginning to play hot and feature the blues, Armstrong emerged in a world where hot music was the norm. Lewis's interest in the Ori band only deepened when Mutt Carey left the group in late 1915 or early 1916, and Joe Oliver was brought in to replace him. What was the context for this? Well, Ori remembered Oliver hanging around the band asking to be given a chance to play. Ori waved him off at first. My old buddy who was playing so loud and wrong, Joe Oliver, and he asked me to give him a chance. I told him I would think it over. He tried many times to organize a band and had a few good musicians in it, but Oliver was all wet. Let's pause for a minute. This is Lewis's hero. But this is Lewis's hero's, one of his dearest friends, talking about what he sounded like when Lewis was still. He says he tried his tone was bad, and that's number one when playing the cornet. His execution was too fast, the way he blew it. And that's interesting because years later, Lewis talks about some advice that King Oliver gave him, and what did he say? Stay on that lead, boy. Stay on that lead. Don't try to do too much. And that sounds remarkably similar to what Ori's saying, talking about Oliver here. Oliver became so frustrated on one occasion after hearing Mutt Carey play in a parade that he threw his horn away. That's notable because Mutt Carey was a choke horn player, just like Joe Oliver. He played most of his stuff through a mute, just like Oliver did later. Oliver recognized his tone problem and worked on it apparently for years, Preston Jackson remembered. Later on, about 1914, I should say, Joe began to improve a lot. He used to practice very hard, and I remember he once told me that it took him 10 years to get a tone on his instrument. Ori remembered teaming up with Oliver. When Oliver came up with me, he and I got together, and I told him, let's work as a team because it's going to be one way or the other. We're going to agree on tone and try to play together rather than blast and try to force those notes. You can't do that. Oliver said, all right, I'm willing. This is notable because when Ori and Oliver had separate bands, there's a famous story that a couple of people talk about. There was a Mrs. Newman uptown. I think it was probably Newcomb. And she had hired both the Oliver band and the Ori band to play, so they would have continuous music. So Oliver band's here, Ori band's there. The Oliver band opens. They're blowing like they're in a Franklin Street honky-tonk. And Miss Newcomb comes in. Oh, no, no, no. She's clutching her pearls. We can't have this. They send Oliver home, and Ori plays the rest of the night. So that shows that Ori had figured out how to play hot music, but play it in such a way that the white folks aren't going to send you home after the first number. And that was a key to making a lot of money. Ori, despite his early criticism, was equally emphatic that it was Joe Oliver who created the new style. He was speaking specifically about the divide between what Oliver played and what Buddy Bolden and Freddie Keppard had previously done. Oliver's 1923 recordings reveal a musician who used many tricks of the trade, including most notably his signature muted wah-wah effect. He would play into buckets, cups, hats to get a different sound from his horn. Oliver's breaks, where the rest of the band would stop and he would play the fill, were also one of his calling cards. He bent notes, executed flawless runs, and had a swing to his playing. He could imbue the horn with the sound of a crying baby or the whinny of a horse. He played with drive, power, imaginative phrasing, and emotion. Mutt Carey remembered Joe Oliver was very strong. He was the greatest freak trumpet player I ever knew. He did most of his playing through cups, glasses, buckets, and mutes. He was the best gut bucket man I ever heard. I called him a freak because the sounds he made were not made by the valves as much as the artificial devices. This in contrast to Louis Armstrong, who played everything through the horn. So I'm going to try to get my thing to scroll down again for me without messing this up. Okay, let's try that again. I just keep losing my mouse. I apologize. There's my mouse. All right, now I can scroll. With Oliver's horn playing down the melody, the Ori Band continued to progress in the constantly evolving New Orleans jazz scene. By the time Oliver arrived, the Ori Band had an established repertoire, a style of its own, and a reputation. People may have viewed Oliver as the leader of the band. Typically, that's what they do when they see a trumpet player in front of a band. It was Ori's band, one that had its own way of doing things, and Oliver had to adapt. Oliver once got booted from a rich family's gig because he played too loud and had to tone it down. Conforming to the Ori Band's use of restraint and nuance served to soften Oliver's rough as pig iron reputation. That's how Ori described him, rough as pig iron. Highlighting his immense skills as a soloist, Preston Jackson remembered, one of the best numbers I ever heard Joe play was eccentric. He took all the breaks, imitating a rooster and a baby. He was a riot in those days. His band, including Johnny Dodds on clarinet, Edward Ory trombone, Ed Garland bass, Henry Zeno drums, Ed Polo on violin, and a guitar player whose name I've forgotten. How those boys could swing, and it was jazz they played too, not ragtime music. Okay, a series of events took place in the summer of 1918 that would lead to Oliver leaving New Orleans for Chicago, Louis joining Kid Ory's band, and Pops creating his own enduring mythology, his 4th of July birthday. We're going to look at this in terms of the events that happened through that summer leading up to Louis registering for the draft and the first codification of the July 4th birthday. I'm not trying to get in or get under anybody's skin about that as an issue or not. I'm trying to provide some context, both for King Oliver leaving and Louis getting into the band, and why a 17-year-old man would want to register for World War II, one of the most awful events of the 20th century. Well, let's see if we can get an answer there. Okay, so let's look at the map here. First shoe to drop was 1918. That was when the Winter Garden Theater was raided at 11:45 on June 19th, 1918. Ori remembered at the Winter Garden, which was a new spot about a block from the roof garden, meaning the Pythian roof garden, right across the street from it. In fact, the prisoners at the jailhouse over across the street from that could hear us playing all night. When the Winter Garden opened, I was hired, and business got so good that it took all the business away from the Pythian Temple roof garden. The owner of the roof garden was very unhappy about this, and he did the usual thing. He called the cops. One night, the wagons backed up, and we saw the sergeant and about 9 or 10 cops come out and come into the hall. It was very early in those days, just about 11. The sergeant told us no one was to move and added that this was a raid. All the people were very quiet and stood there like statues as a policeman rounded them up, except a few that managed to escape. Then along came the sergeant, and the police asked him, "What about the band, Sarge?" He said, "Well, I guess you better run them in too, just to be on the safe side, right?" So we all went to jail, and then through night court, everyone who had it paid $250 to get out. Now, mind you, $250 is probably more than they got paid for the gig that night. Joe Oliver was furious. He had been arrested on a disturbing the peace charge the previous August while rehearsing a vaudeville show with Mary Mack and Armand Perrone. He had had enough. Now, that may have been the moment that he left. But I think he may have stuck around a little longer. And here's why I say that. 2 weeks later, music was effectively banned at cabarets for the duration of the war by a police edict. For all the talk about Storyville, let's put something in perspective here. Storyville was a roughly 16 square block, whites only, red light district. Here we're talking about the entire city being shut down. I would think that probably had more impact. And that may have been the final straw. In fact, this one, our history is filled with people like this. Police Commissioner Mooney decided that he and he alone could define what a cabaret was. So if he came up and he was amenable to you staying open, he'd say, "You're not a cabaret." But if you wanted to close your business, you go, "Oh, you're a cabaret." And he defined a cabaret as a place where music, singing, and dancing are going on. Guess he doesn't go to church. So, for those of us that are still kind of get caught up in the Storyville myth, Storyville was the beginning of the shutdown of the nightlife in New Orleans. It wasn't the end of it. It was just the low-hanging fruit that was easily scotched and done away with. This was a process that continued through to 1919 and 1920, through to the Volstead Act, when we got Prohibition. Now, Ori said, "I received an offer to take my band to Chicago, but I was doing too well in New Orleans to leave." Joe, however, along with Jimmy Noon, who was my clarinetist, decided to go up to Chicago. And here are Joe Oliver and Jimmy Noon in Chicago. I'm going to guess this is probably by Christmas, 1918, because you can see the decorations that are probably Christmas or New Year's decorations in the photograph. We can't be sure exactly when Oliver left, but we know he was in Chicago by September 12th when he registered for the draft. Now, it must have been a blow to Ori to lose King Oliver. On a personal level, they were the best of friends. And despite Ori's statements about Oliver's formative years as a musician, he generally respected Oliver and credited him with innovation and imagination, a natural who came up with the new style, Ori said. Before he left, Oliver discussed the band's future with Ori. Joe told me before he left that he could recommend someone to take my place. I told him I appreciated his thought, but that I had already picked out his replacement. Now, it might seem obvious, particularly in hindsight, that Kid Ory would select Louis Armstrong to replace Joe Oliver, but he had reasons not to. Louis had just turned 17 that summer, making him far younger than his bandmates. Ory had auditioned Louis by letting him substitute for Oliver at the band's regular gig at Pete Lala's Cabaret. This is Pete Lala's, one of his 2 clubs. This is the one at 1500 Iberville at Murray. According to Manuel Mineta, Oliver had a thing going on with vaudevillian Mary Mack, and he got Louis to come and sub while they were off doing their Oliver Mary Mack stuff. And he said the crowd stayed outside during Louis's set. Then when Oliver made his entrance, the place filled up. Pete Lala gave Ory grief about the substitution, thinking Louis was hurting business. On another occasion, the exasperated club owner shouted at Louis, "Put in the boot! Put in the boot!" He was Italian. He had a very heavy accent. What he was trying to tell Louis was, put in the mute. Put in the mute. Because King Oliver always played with the mute, and to Pete Lala's thinking, that's why everybody liked him, because he played with a mute, and everybody didn't like Louis because he didn't have a mute in his horn. Caused all the band to laugh like crazy because they knew he was saying mute, and Louis is going, what's he saying? What's he saying? On another occasion, Lala just considered Louis a poor substitute for Oliver. Indeed, that friction with Lala may have prompted Louis to register for the draft, and that may explain a few curiosities on his draft card. By the way, Pete Lala is just what everybody called him. His real name was Pete Chiaccio, and he was a connected Sicilian businessman. I don't mean to make any aspersions by that description, but let's just say when the police chief got killed, everybody said, who killed the chief? There was a lot of tension about the Italian folks that were in right there. There were Italian lynchings and that sort of thing. But Pete Chiaccio was a connected guy. And as I go through the stories here, you'll understand what I mean by that. All right, so the cabarets are shut down, the Winter Garden raid, Oliver's probably gone. And then in mid-August, a supplemental draft call with a reporting date of September 12th was announced on August 24th. The amended Selective Service Act lowered the reporting age down to 18 from 21 and up to 45 from 30. That expanded draft meant that Pete Chiaccio, Pete Lala, who was too old for the first call-up, suddenly had to register for the draft. At 17, Louis did not. Now here's Pete Chiaccio's draft registration. You can see he lists himself as a saloon keeper, 1500 Iberville. We just saw a picture of that place. So suddenly he knows, everyone's conscious, who's got to register for the draft. So Pete Lala knows if that new kid in the band is actually 18 like they're telling me, he's going to have a draft card. Well, here's Louis's draft card, and let's take a look at this here. Well, first of all, the sergeant that filled it out wrote Louis phonetically, but that at least tells us that that's how he heard it. Louis. He said Louis. Now, it may not seem curious that Louis Armstrong would list himself as a musician, but he had every reason not to. World War I draft, you could get deferments if you were married. You could also get deferments if you had what we would call today an essential job. Louis drove a coal cart. Remember when the war ends in My Life in New Orleans and he says he heard the war was over, and he goes and unloads 2 more buckets of coal after he hears the war's over, and then wait a minute, he goes, wait a minute, I don't have to haul this coal anymore. The war's over. And he says goodbye to his mule Daisy and says, I don't think I shall see you again, and walks off the job. Kid Ory does the same thing. He had been working at the Naval Yard down at Poland Avenue, and when he heard the war was over, he said he jumped on top of the streetcar because all the music had been shut down, and it also meant nobody was going to get drafted. And in fact, none of these people that registered on the day Lewis registered went to war. The war was over in 2 months from this date. So why would he list musician? And why would he list Pete Lala as his employer? The Ory band played there one night a week. No band's going to list one gig as their employer, unless perhaps the whole point of this exercise was so Lewis, who had been telling Lala that he was old enough to be in the club, could go to Mr. Pete and say, "Look, Mr. Pete, I'm bona fide. Look, I'm 18. Even has your name on it." But here's something that's interesting about how this is filled out. This is what Lewis wanted. The rest of the information on here, I can't imagine he cared a whole lot, because he mashes up Lala's Cabaret and his first-class theater, giving the address of the cabaret, but the street the theater was on. Wasn't too worried about the details on that part. Now, July 4th, 1900, what's most fascinating to me about this is it's exactly a year and a month prior to when he was actually born. Anybody raise teenagers here? Does that sound like how the way a 17-year-old would tell a fib? Because it's easy to remember, year and a month. And you could tell he probably didn't quite do the math before he went to register, because it looks like they wrote 18 first. One last point before, and I'm going to go on and really try to concentrate on his time with Lewis and in the Ory band in a minute. But my final point about this is none of this is something we should get hung up about Lewis, say, offering this fib. How many of you had uncles and grandfathers and fathers that lied that they'd go in the service and fight the Nazis? Doris Day, when she died a couple of years ago, they played her oral history, an interview she had done on Terry Grove's show. And she recalled how she got into music. She was 16, a big band leader heard her sing and wanted her to go on tour. She says, "I'm only 16. She says, "Bring your mom, we'll tell her by you're 18, it's fine." And she does that. Years later, she's going to celebrate her 30th birthday. Her mom comes in and says, "Honey, I'm going to give you the best news any woman gets on her 30th birthday. You're not 30. She had completely forgotten about it. So I don't think we should get too caught up in Lewis saying this, because, as we know, once you tell one story to the federal government, you've either got to turn witness or stay with your story, right? I'm being a little flip, but we shouldn't get caught up in this, and we should take the information for what it shows us, is that Lewis wanted to get his career going, and this is what stood in the way, and he did what he needed to do. Ory said there were many good, experienced trumpet players in town, but none of them had young Lewis's possibilities. Ory shared his decision with Lewis as Oliver Noon's train departed. Lewis said, "The minute train started to pull out, I was on my way out of the Illinois station to my coal cart when Kid Ory called me. He said, 'You still blowing that cornet?' he hollered, and I ran back. He said he'd heard a lot of talk about little Lewis. I pricked up my ears. He said that when the boys in the band found out for sure that Joe Oliver was leaving, they told him to get little Lewis to take Joe's place. He was a little in doubt at first, but after he looked around the town, he decided I was the right one to have to try at taking the great man's place. So he told me to wash up and then come play the gig with him that same night, and what a thrill it was to think I was considered up to taking Joe Oliver's place in the best band in town." Ory acquired a horn for Lewis to play, and he used it to full effect. Armstrong proved the perfect understudy to King Oliver, as he knew many of the tunes. Oops. What's happening to me here? As he knew many of the tunes and the band's arrangement. Armstrong makes Ori out to be a benevolent figure in the telling of the story. Wanted to offer this up. This is another place that Lewis lived, 1233 Purdue Street, going back to our photo from earlier. This is the 1200 block of Purdue Street, the odd side. So we don't know exactly what this is. I haven't gone and compared this on the Sanborn maps, but there's a general view of the scene, what it was like. There were many good experienced trumpet players in town, Kid Ory said, but none of them had Lewis's possibilities. Ory shared his decision with Lewis as Oliver Noon's train pulled away. I do apologize. I keep losing control of my mouse pad and losing my text. And perhaps we'll not worry about the pictures here, and I will just read my text so we can finish this on time. Said Kid Ory was so nice and kind. He had such patience. The first night with them was a pleasure instead of a drag. After the first gig with the kid, I was in. Ory's instinct about Armstrong's potential, of course, proved correct. Remembering it years later, he said, Lewis came up like a sunflower. After he joined me, Lewis improved so fast it was amazing. He had a wonderful ear, a wonderful memory. All you had to do was to hum or whistle a new tune to him, and he'd know it right away. And if he played a tune once, he'd never forget it. Within 6 months, everybody in New Orleans knew about him. For his part, Armstrong knew and appreciated what he had playing in Ory's band, which was to perform the music he loved and get paid for it well. At the time, he viewed the membership as his arrival and calling the Ory band the cream of the crop. I was looking forward to bigger things, especially since Kid Ory had give me a chance to play. Ory did get a lot of jobs. He started giving them his own dances, Monday nights at Economy Hall. Monday night was slow night in New Orleans, and we didn't get much work other places. But Kid Ory did so well at Economy Hall that he kept it up for months and months and made a lot of dough doing it. Armstrong took in a kaleidoscope of jobs working for Ory. And he talks about extensively about how they were blowing away a lot of the established musicians there. And I'm going to skip here to the very end. With the armistice in Europe on November 11th, Ory was sent home from his day job at the shipyard on Poland Avenue. Lewis bid farewell to his mule, Daisy. The music scene, particularly at the cabarets, had been shut down due to the war, and with the celebrations of the armistice lurked the Spanish flu, which returned in a second wave in a more virulent form, in fact, killing Kid Ory's sister Lizzie on New Year's Day 1919. By February, the flu had subsided, and things were getting back to normal. On a Monday night in early 1919, bandleader Fate Marable dropped by a dance that Kid Ory's band was playing. He soon decided that he wanted to hire him, and Lewis went and joined Fate's band. The Ory band was a significant group for Lewis to be in at the time. They were a hot band. He learned to play that way. He learned to play with nuance. He learned to play in front of many different audiences. One night he's playing on Franklin Street. Another night he's playing an Uptown Society dance. The next natural step was going into Fate Marable's band to learn to read music and play in those arrangements. But it's not as seamless a cut as we would have it in most Armstrong biographies, because Ory and Armstrong get together one last time before he leaves New Orleans. Lewis had just gotten back at the end of August on the Sydney, and he met with Johnny Dodds and Kid Ory down at Ben Mulligan's Saloon, and they drank sweet whiskey and got really drunk, and they all swore they were going to go to California. Well, Ory goes to California, gets the band a gig, sends a telegram back. Manuel Manetta goes around to collect Johnny Dodds and Louis Armstrong and Joe Lindsay, the drummer that said he was going to go with them. And the whole thing falls apart because Johnny Dodds and Joe Lindsay's wives explain to them that they're not going to California. They probably could have saved the exercise by starting there, but and then Louis said he wouldn't go without Joe and Johnny. So that was the end of that part of the Ory and Armstrong episode. And for the next episode, we have the Hot 5 recordings, and those are much more interesting to listen to than me talking about musicians. I don't think we have much time left, but if there are any questions, please. Sure. I got a unique opportunity a year and a half ago, and the man who had bought the Woodland Plantation House where Kid Ory was born on that site, it's also the house where the largest slave uprising in American history began. The first blood was shed in the four walls of our structure. So a guy called me a year and a half ago and said, did I want to put a museum in his house? Because, I get phone calls like that every day. So we worked out a deal, and in February we opened the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. Half the house tells a story of the 1811 rebellion. The other half tells the story of Kid Ory. And we've got the largest Kid Ory holding in the world, including the valve trombone he played here in New Orleans over a century ago. We've got original sheets in Lil Hardin's hand from the Hot 5 sessions. We've got original sheets in Jelly's hand from the Red Hot Peppers sessions. And we've got the lyrics from the Hot 5 session of I'm Not Rough in Lewis's hand, as they tried to remember how they used to play with King Oliver and the band, and Louis tried to remember the lyrics to how we used to be performed by the Ory Band. And so we're open Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 3. Come on out and see us. Thank you, Satchma Fest, very much for having me.